Hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining another talk today, organized by the Hope Center on preventing abuse against elderly persons. Now, all of us are supposed to get old sometime or the other. So, it is very important that we pay attention and make sure that elderly people are not facing abuse, whether it's at home, in your own house, or it's in your neighborhood, or whether it's with friends or families. Elderly people have sacrificed a lot and given up so many things in their lives to raise us and to take care of us. Even if we are not talking about elderly parents, we are talking about uncles or aunts, and therefore we would be very grateful if you pay careful attention to what constitutes abuse and how should we work towards preventing it. We will share a leaflet from the Social Welfare Department of the Hong Kong government on further details about what we are going to talk about now. When it comes to protecting elderly persons against abuse, we need to first understand and define what is elder abuse. Well, generally speaking, it does not just mean the specific commission of abuse, but also omission of any act by which the welfare or safety of an elderly person comes to harm. Usually, the elderly person being abused and the abuser are known to each other, or to the abusers that are responsible for the care of the elderly person being abused, such as family members living together or staff of the organization providing services for the elderly person. The abuse could range from physical injury or suffering inflicted on an elderly person on purpose, or it could be accidental as well. But physical abuse can also happen in the absence of any preventive measures. To illustrate this further, imagine that you are feeling extremely cold in this weather. But you do understand that elderly people will feel much more cold because their body is not able to generate the heat that you and me can. In those circumstances, it is not just abuse when you purposely don't give enough warm clothes to your elderly family member or the elderly person living in your house or around you. Abuse is also not making sure that the person is warm and secure or does not have enough warm clothes. That by itself is also abuse. But remember, we are not just talking about physical abuse, we are also talking about psychological abuse. This is a pattern of behavior or attitudes towards an elderly person that endangers or impairs the elderly person's psychological health, such as acts of insult, scolding, isolation, causing fear to the elderly person for a long duration, intrusion into the elderly person's privacy, and unnecessary restriction of the elderly person's freedom of access and movement. If this isn't enough, with the current circumstances because of the COVID pandemic and many people losing their jobs and livelihoods, it could also range to financial abuse, which is an act which involves depriving an elderly person of his or her wealth or not acting in an elderly person's interests, such as taking away an elderly person's possessions, their pension, or the money that comes to them from either the government or their former employer, or transferring his or her assets without consent. If that wasn't enough, there can be neglect and abandonment. Neglect is severe or persistent lack of attention to an elderly person's basic needs. For example, and just as we've spoken before, adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical treatment, nursing care, etc. That could easily endanger or impair an elderly person's health and safety if these services or this help is not provided. It could also include the failure of provision of medicine and aids according to medical advice, which leads to physical harm of an elderly person. If a formal service provider, such as a residential care home for the elderly, integrated home care services team, hospital, etc., fails to perform its caring responsibility and causes harm to an elderly person, the case may also be considered as neglect. Remember, under the rules and regulations of the Hong Kong government, abandonment is also constituted as an act of elderly persons being abandoned without justifiable reasons, committed either by a carer or a guardian, which directly or indirectly endangers or impairs the elderly person's physical or psychological well-being. To cite an example, upon the elderly person's hospitalization, a family member gives a wrong correspondence address, phone number, resists or avoids contact repeatedly, or refuses to provide correspondence address, phone number to the hospital, which makes it impossible for the hospital to contact the carer or guardian to discuss the medical and welfare issues of the elderly person. In very severe cases, unfortunately, there's also sexual abuse, which is the act of sexual assault on an elderly person, such as exposure of sexual organ to an elderly person, indecent assault, and unfortunately, even cases of rape. We would urge you, plead you, to please understand how we can help elderly persons from being abused. If you are seeing, witnessing in and around you elderly persons being abused, or those who know they should ask relevant assistance from professionals such as registered social workers, healthcare personnel, and police officers as early as possible so as to remedy the situation. Some of you might not easily know who the registered social workers in your area are. So we would request you to reach out to the social welfare department and to report any case of an abuse of an elderly person, whether you've seen it yourself, heard of such a situation, or even come to know from a third party that such a thing is happening. If you do see an elderly person who's supposed to be taken care of by family members or by help that has been hired, but not properly taken care of or in a bad shape, please also report that to the social welfare department. Professionals of various disciplines will offer assistance to elderly people being abused. Whenever necessary, they will join hands to formulate follow-up plans for the elderly people and their family members through discussions or case conferences. Professionals will respect the views of the elderly persons as far as possible and provide them with protection and assistance in the most appropriate manner. Bearing in mind that the safety of the elderly people is the prime concern, professionals will also help abusers solve their personal or family problems and where possible will try their best to help the elderly persons improve their relationship with their family members, including the abusers. Last but not the least, we would like to give you some information on how to seek assistance. Persons in need of assistance may approach district elderly community centers or integrated family service centers, integrated service centers in respective districts. Telephone numbers for inquiries and addresses of these centers are available on the Social Welfare Department website at www.swd.gov.hk. If the elderly person being abused is receiving other social services, she or he may seek assistance from the social worker of the service unit concerned, who may arrange referrals when necessary. Let us now help you with the phone numbers of these services that you can call up and report any abuse, or refer an elderly person to call up these numbers to ask for help. The Social Welfare Department hotline is 2343-2255. The hotline for the Family Crisis Support Center, which runs 24 hours, is 18288. The number for the Cease Crisis Center 24-hour hotline is 18281. Friends, last but not the least, it is not just important that you make sure that elderly people don't get abused. An equally important duty that you have is to make sure that bad things or abuse